Our story today is about a very controversial figure in Arizona history, mostly because of the tactics he used in subduing renegade Apaches. His name was King Woolsey, and it's an exercise in why we shouldn't necessarily judge the past by today's standards. Anyway, Woolsey was born in Alabama in 1832. And it's rumored, without any evidence, that in his early 20s, he was involved in a slave insurrection in Cuba in 1853 to 1855, which would have put him to be about 21 to 23. Now, there's no documentation about this, but it was said that the British arranged to release a bunch of prisoners, which Woolsey was one. And indeed, he ended up in California on a British ship. But that's the only evidence that anything like that happened. Anyway, that we find him in Yuma in 1860. He's about 29 years old, and he gets a job as a mule skinner. He arrived in Yuma with two friends, and other than their horses, they didn't have $5 between them. Then he ended up going up to Fort Yuma, where he gets a job supplying goods for the military, which came into Fort Yuma from California in 1862 to deal with the Confederates. In 1862, there was also a gold strike at La Paz, Arizona. And also in 1862, Woolsey and one of his friends ended up purchasing Agua Caliente Ranch on the north side of the Heell River, pretty close across from Stanwyck Station. You might recall Stanwyck Station is where Jack Swilling raided the hay storage areas that was supplying the Union Army coming in from California. And he was very successful at it. Anyway, he purchased the ranch for $1,800 in gold. So how did a guy that shows up in Yuma with a horse and $5 end up with $1,800 in gold in such a short fashion? Was he involved in the La Paz gold strike? Anyway, Woolsey got his first taste of Indian depredations when he was on the south side of the Gila with two of his workers gathering wild grass and loading it on a wagon. They were attacked by a dozen Apaches. They only had one shotgun amongst them, a double-barrel shotgun, which Woolsey took, and his first shot fell short without doing any damage. But apparently the Apaches thought that he was probably using a single-shot weapon, and the leader urged his troops to attack, and Woolsey waited till the last second and brought the leader down, and the other Indians fled. Then he went and got some reinforcements and came back to finish the job and ended up hanging their leader from a tree. Well, you know, people would frown upon that today, but it had a purpose because the other Apaches wouldn't come anywhere near that area with that body still hanging there. And he had work to do. Anyway, in 1863, it was also rumored, with some proof, that he joined the Walker Mining Party that was led by Jack Swilling up the Hassayampa River. Now, Swilling had been there before in the past and had fought Indians on a river which he called Unknown because it didn't have a name at that time. But anyway, Swilling ended up over in New Mexico by 1862, where he put together a militia unit to fight Apaches that were attacking the ranches in the area. And when the Confederates came in, his unit was grafted into the Confederate Army with orders to continue his Indian fighting. In the meantime, Joseph Walker, who is not John Walker, that was the leader of the militia of the Pimas and Maricopas, Joseph Walker, who had been exploring all over California, decided to make a trip across northern Arizona. He went across the Grand Canyon area, into Colorado, down to Santa Fe, and down the Rio Grande to Mesilla, where he stayed out of the fray that was going on with the Confederates, and kind of established a temporary fort called Fort West. And this is where he met Jack Swilling. And Jack Swilling convinced Walker that he knew an area on a river in Arizona with no name, where there was high indications of mineralization. So Walker and Swilling left Camp West and came into Arizona to the Pima villages, through Tucson to the Pima villages, and up the Cassiamp River, which is still quite a ways from Agua Caliente. And this is where supposedly Woolsey joined them. But they went up the Cassiamp River. They didn't go to La Paz. And when they got up about 5 miles west of where Prescott is today, they established some claims on both sides of the river, but were pretty much out of supplies. And they sent a party back down to the Pima villages to get resupplied. And on their way, completely by accident, they ran into the People's Weaver Party coming up from Yuma through La Paz, and met them out in the middle of the desert. Well, both sides claim to be the founders, by historians, of Rich Hill, where all that gold was found on their journey. And the only thing I could figure, because nobody ever put 2 and 2 together, is that somehow the parties went on to resupply at the Pima villages, and they must have joined forces, because another author said that Swilling found Rich Hill on his return trip to La Paz. Well, apparently coming up the Hassayampa River, they weren't anywhere near La Paz. But somehow this all got convoluted, and this is a perfect example of how the legend of the Lost Dutchman gold mine got so convoluted by historians taking certain amounts of true information and combining them and just adding to them or taking away to make this such a confrontational issue. And I don't know that we'll ever get to the bottom of just exactly how all this came apart, or where Woolsey was, with what party, or had he gone up there ahead of time on his own, or just what. But Swilling and Walker eventually made a big strike over on Lynx Creek, which is north of Dewey, Arizona. And Woolsey established another ranch just south of Dewey, Arizona, called Agua Fria. And there were many, many Indian depredations going on. In fact, you know, La Paz is where whichever party, Waltz must have been with the Weaver People's Party that came up through Yuma to La Paz, because he dropped out at La Paz and wasn't with them as they come on across. But he was in Bradshaw Mountains during one of these, some of these attacks, and he signed a petition to the territorial governor for protection, with a lot of other men signing the petition. And I think this is probably the time when the governor of Arizona ordered in 500 Spencer rifles to be distributed amongst the civilians to protect themselves from the Apaches, where the Apaches ended up with some of those weapons from raids that they had conducted and was using against the Army at Apache Leap battle. Anyway, even Woolsey was not immune to attack. His ranch was a hit one time. And, well, let me back up a little bit. During these negotiations for protection, Woolsey put together a party and tried to make it a treaty with some of the Indians. And before this treaty, down at Agua Caliente, um, Woolsey had a small mill, and he was making pinole, which was a flour based upon ground wild Indian corn and brown sugar added, and it was a staple for everybody. And the Indians particularly loved this pinole. So he laced a bag of flour with strychnine, knowing that the Indians would find it and steal it, and went ahead and had a parley with their leaders. Well, when the effects of the strychnine began to take effect, the leaders all jumped up and started to exit, and Woolsey and his party cut them all down. Up to that point, Woolsey had at least dispatched 120 renegades previous to this. Well, then when his ranch was hit, he organized a group of 60 well-armed men, all good shots, and started pursuing the Apaches that had taken all these animals from his ranch and other ranches, and followed them down the Verde River until they got to the confluence of the Salt River and the Verde River. Well, there they were again in need of resupply, so he sent a party to the Pima villages and established on the south side of the river at the Maryville's Crossing, as we know it today, which was also called the Roe Crossing. And this is where people crossed the river to go to Fort McDowell later. But he established a temporary base there called Fort Badger. And while waiting, 30 Pima Indians and 30 Maricopa Indians volunteered to join his group. And they left the Verde River, following the river all the way, and the first day they went 15 miles. Now, the river has a lot of crooks and turns in it, and don't know whether he was talking about as the crow flies 15 miles, or all the twists and turns in the river. So I went to Google Earth and I measured by following all the crooks and turns of the river, and it turned out to be 15.2 miles to where Canyon Lake is. And there they said, after 15 miles, they came to a mouth of a large canyon. That's exactly where Canyon Lake is today. So the next day they traveled all day, still following the river, and they have a large party of people now, you know. And it turned out to be 23 miles to where Roosevelt Lake was. Well, the battle that took place was called Bloody Tanks and was said to be in Miami. But if they were following the river for 2 days and the word Tonto Basin was used in one of the reports because he was making regular reports to Colonel Carleton and also sending reports to the minor newspaper in Prescott. And Tonto Basin was mentioned. Well, when they got to the Tonto Basin where Roosevelt Dam and Roosevelt Lake would be today, they would have still been 24 miles from Bloody Tanks at Miami. So did the battle take place at Miami, or did it take place at Tonto Basin? Anyway, he was outnumbered. Even with the large party he was vastly outnumbered and was facing extermination himself. So he called for a parley. And 30 chiefs, 30 leaders from the Tonto Apache tribe, there again, the use of the word Tonto, they weren't in the Pinell Indian area, they were in the Tonto area, came for a parley. And during the parley, according to this one report, other reports don't go into this detail, but I read everything I could find on that involving Walker and Weaver and Peoples and Swilling, trying to find out more information. Anyway, during this parley, an Indian came in and distributed some knives amongst the leaders. And the word had come down that all of Woolsey's party, including the other Indians, the Pimas and the Maricopas, were to be killed. And Woolsey, on a predetermined signal, had his people open up on them and kill 42 Indians in that particular event. And this is how convoluted things become, because now 2 separate battles all happened at one place. There was no Pinnell, there was no strychnine used in bloody tanks, but I don't know where the battle actually took place, but it doesn't seem feasible that it took place in Miami. They would have had to travel something like 55 miles in one day in a canyon they couldn't get out of, following the Salt River. Anyway, Woolsey continued his Indian fighting. He was one of the first people to bring in he was the very first person to bring a thrashing machine into Arizona, which I have a picture of a 1862 thrashing machine. It's the weirdest looking thing you ever saw. When I was in high school, I worked for various farmers in Kansas thrashing. I knew what a thrashing machine looked like, but look at this one. Anyway, he was, because of the battles that he fought with the Pinnell Treaty, or what they call the Pinnell Massacre, and the Bloody Tanks incident, he was highly recognized by the first Arizona legislature. He was awarded a lieutenant colonelship in charge of Arizona militia to deal with Indians. Arizonans loved what he did with the Indians. I don't care how controversial it was. And there again, I repeat, it's not necessarily wise to judge the tactics of the past by today's standards. Let's take Geronimo, for example. It's a perfect example. Geronimo was raiding in Mexico to the point that there was hardly a hamlet that hadn't been hit. And many people were murdered and butchered in the process. And the Mexican authorities made an agreement with Geronimo that if he would stop his raiding, they would supply him with supplies at his base camp. And he agreed to that, but he never stopped raiding. And the authorities, after that, a period of time, decided that this can't go on. So they decided to go up and wipe out his band. And when they got there, unfortunately, Geronimo and his men, which he claimed they were out hunting, was actually raiding at the time, and it cost him his family. His family was killed in his absence. And he said he hated the Mexicans from then on and killed every one of them he could come across. But he was doing that before, during, and after. So there again is an example of not judging the past by today's standards, because what the tactics that Woolsey used today are unfathomable in the minds of people. But it's kind of like President Roosevelt told Geronimo. Geronimo made an elegant plea with Roosevelt to go home to Arizona. And Roosevelt says, "I'm sorry, I can't do that." You see, it would kind of be like inviting Osama bin Laden to a parade in Phoenix today. You just couldn't do that. Anyway, Woolsey was elected to he was responsible for the formation of the Democrat Party in Arizona, and he was elected to the legislature 5 times. And he ran for U.S. Senate, but was defeated. And he was an Arizona pioneer, and even like so many of them who were still in their 20s when they were scouts for the military, and just unknown numbers of very famous people here in Arizona that were responsible for Arizona history. And just in case you're interested, if you would like to visit the Superstition Mountain Museum, Clayworth has donated King Woolsey Sharp's rifle, and it's on display at the museum.
Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.